Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. I want to ask your forgiveness for having to go through the whole procedure of showing your passports and having the papers with you and all this. For us it is the second event that we are organizing, and hopefully things will get better and we will be able to communicate with our audiences in a much more humane way in the future. So, in November 2019, the Aikaterini Lascaridis Foundation, in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, established a Center for China Studies. The ceremony took place at Maximou and was attended by the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. The Center for China Studies is the fruit of the collaboration between the Aikaterini Lascaridis Foundation and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the leading academic research of China. The CASS-ALF Centre for China Studies, for short we use the term CACS, is housed at the Foundation's premises here. Both Greece and China are countries with great civilization and rich history, so this cooperation, built with the objective of promoting exchange and cooperation in arts, humanities and social sciences, is founded on solid ground. In the context of the operation of the Center of Chinese Studies, the Aikaterini Lascaridis Foundation requested the support and advice of Dr. Konstantinos Tsimonis, until recently lecturer in Chinese sociology at King's College. Under Professor Tsimonis' guidance, we organize a series of lectures in order to introduce the general public in Greece to the recent history of China. Today's presentation is the first of a series of monthly events focusing in modern China. The theme of the event today is China and Western Modernity, the century of humiliation and China's struggle to regain world power status. We are honored to host as main speaker tonight Dr. Igor Rogela, lecturer in world policy at the University of London. The event is being broadcast online with live streaming on the Foundation's website, Facebook, but also through the Zoom platform. I would like to stress that through the Zoom platform, viewers are able to send comments and questions that will be addressed during the discussion period that will follow. For this, I would like to thank Chariklia Panagu, a bright young student at Pandion University who is working with us for 2 months. With these general introductory words, and in the anticipation of a very interesting discussion that will follow, I pass the floor to Professor Tsimonis.
Thank you, Mr. Mazarakis. I would like to thank the Foundation for hosting this lecture series. We hope to bring prominent scholars from around the world here in Athens, in Piraeus, to share their knowledge and insights on China. Let me say a couple of words about our speaker today, who is also a good friend. Dr. Igor Rogela is lecturing global politics, working mostly on international infrastructure and Chinese politics. He was previously based at the Lao China Institute. Now he's in University College London. He has published in the top journals of the field, such as China Quarterly and Political Geography. And his talk today is titled The Century of Humiliation and China's Struggle to Regain World Power Status. And this is a very interesting talk and very topical because China's past remains relevant today in many ways, in the sense of victimhood that is alive through education and popular culture, and of course in Chinese nationalism, which is becoming increasingly xenophobic, limiting even the foreign policy choices of the Chinese leadership. Now we'll discuss these dimensions, of course, in the Q&A. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogelia. Igor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you. First, of course, to the Foundation for inviting me. It's a great honor to be, of course, the inaugural speaker for your new and exciting series of lectures. It also feels even better to be able to deliver this in person. I know it's a hybrid event. It's also a first for me, although I think there'll be quite many this year. So it's great to stand here in this beautiful library and be able to talk about things that excite me, and then hopefully we'll come to a place where we can have a lively discussion afterwards. Thank you also, Kostas Timonis, of course, for the introduction. I hope to be able to return the favor soon and organize something at UCL and invite you over. So this evening I want to talk about two things, really. And the first is essentially a story of how Western modernity, and I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by this, how it arrived in China and what consequences that had. And this story has quite a few different characters, if you think of it as a kind of play. There's also lots of different objects of importance to this story. So I'll talk about paper money, I'll talk about silver, I'll talk about copper, I will talk a little bit about opium, tea, porcelain, all these things, all these objects, assets, sort of tradable goods, they were very important at the time. But alongside these props, you have a cast of very diverse characters, ranging from drunk English sailors to Armenian silver lenders, and arrogant Qing officials and angry Chinese peasants revolting against the many injustices that they faced. So it's a very complex story that stretches along this very long century of humiliation. This is a more recent term, actually, of course, has been to designate this century of humiliation. And this is, roughly speaking, from the mid-19th century to 1949, when China is then, for all intents and purposes, liberated by the Communist Party. And this brings me to the second part of the talk for tonight, which will be a kind of afterthought. So I'll talk a little bit as a kind of epilogue, almost, where I want to look at this idea of how this humiliation, how this idea of how this persistent belief in victimhood affects China's relations with the world, but also, its own kind of self-image. So we'll outline, let's say, where the notion of national humiliation comes from, particularly by exploring the trauma that happened as a result of China's crash with Western modernity. I forgot the clip. So before we go there, I have a kind of a story to kind of talk about here. So let me begin in the year 2000 in Hong Kong. So at that time, 3 artifacts were put up for auction at the world's 2 most prestigious auction houses, so Christie's and Sotheby's. These were animal figures. Actually, they were the heads of a tiger, a monkey, and an ox, to be precise. Collectively, these form part of 12 statues or bronze heads known as the zodiac animals or the zodiac statues. They're part of a set of 12 because they represent 12 of the animals of the Chinese zodiac. They used to be part of a fountain in the old summer palace in Beijing. But what's crucial for the story here is that these figurines were looted by British and French soldiers in 1860 when the old summer palace was burned down. Interestingly, it was burned down at the orders of Lord Elgin, the son of the Lord Elgin who stole the marbles from the Parthenon. So quite a family there. And during this looting, the bronzes were hacked off the fountain, packed up, and for the longest time they kind of disappeared into private ownership, only to then resurface in the year 2000 and an auction in Hong Kong. This sparked off a huge amount of anger, both government and kind of popular anger. In the end, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, Polygroup, actually bought the figures for a sum that was wildly above the expected price. So for the 3 heads, they paid $4 million. This was way above the kind of expected price. So I think Christie's and Sotheby's were very happy. And then in 2009, 2 more heads appeared. This time it was an auction in Paris. This was a rabbit and a rat. And these 2 actually used to be owned by Yves Saint Laurent, and then were now being sold by his business partner, Pierre Berger. A Chinese businessman again won the auction, again by overbidding quite wildly. But then he refused to pay the money. He said, actually, no, this whole auction is completely unfair. These objects are stolen. China and Chinese nationals should not be paying to retrieve them back. There was a big scandal because Pierre Berger said, I will sell them to you as soon as you say that you are oppressing rights of Tibetans, etc., etc. So he was, kind of enjoying the publicity, I think. So in the end, nothing happened. But later on, a different owner who acquired the statues then actually donated them to China as a gesture of goodwill. So they actually returned to China. 5 are still missing. But they are kind of a recurring motif. They appear on a stamp collection. There's reproductions of them all over China. And, this kind of gets you to wonder, like, what is it so important about these statues? Yes, they're kind of cute animal heads, which, we all like, of course. But why have they become so important? Why have they become imbued with so much meaning and so much, kind of national fervor? And of course, it's because they've become associated very closely with this idea of national humiliation. And of course, by retrieving these objects, by returning them to China, you can also then say that, in essence, you are dealing with this legacy of humiliation. In essence, righting these old wrongs. But so, how did this humiliation start from? Where does it come from? Why has it left such an important mark on Chinese society? So this is essentially what I want to talk about today. How this incorporation into modernity happened, why it was so traumatic, and why it still causes so much both official and popular anger, because it's not just the kind of the party narrative. Okay, so historical context. So you're celebrating 200 years from the start of the War of Independence in Greece. So let's start from there, 1821. What is China doing? China is still a huge agrarian empire ruled by the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty originally was founded by Manchu invaders, let's call them, but they actually very quickly became Chinese, adopted not just the custom, but actually became guardians of Chinese cultural and civilizational achievements. So I'm a political scientist, so of course I'm really fascinated by the state and what the state looks like. And this is an amazing state. It has survived millennia. It has one of the most complex bureaucracies that manages this huge land, a huge amount of people, and so on. It's an old and venerable state. It's also a society which, even though it was extremely unequal, retained a kind of commitment to meritocracy with things like exams for positions and so on. And yes, they were over time eroded by corrupt practices, and the rich got ahead, and that's fine. But the commitment was there in a way that never existed in Europe until maybe the French Revolution at the earliest. Right? So it was also a society which was quite progressive in certain ways. But for the purposes of our story, this was at a time also a state that was losing the grip on the country. Why? Well, because China's population grew massively during the Qing period. You can say this is a reflection of good governance, of the relative peace and prosperity that was there. Partly, though, it's also because new crops were introduced from the New World. Things like corn, potatoes. I mean, also tomatoes and chilies, but they're not that nutritious. I think it's the corn and the potatoes that precipitated this growth in population. So while, yes, okay, the Chinese probably didn't discover America. I mean, there are historians that would disagree with this, but China was definitely part of the early modern world, right? So we see this in the fact that it was affected by, let's say, new crops. It was affected by this, emerging set of trading networks that were happening during the time. The modern world and its increasingly connected geography, right? But at this time, in 1821, China was still certain of its superiority, of its centrality of its civilization, particularly in its immediate region. So Qing China dealt with the world on its own terms. This is something that I would like you to remember. So neighboring lands like Korea, Vietnam, and so on in particular would actually, compete to send missions of tribute to Beijing that would then enable them to have formal relations with China, to trade with China. And even the more recently arrived European traders, they were safely confined to the southern fringes of the empire. They weren't really a big bother as far as the court in Beijing is concerned. But only a few decades later, 2 decades later to be precise, China's status collapsed dramatically, right? From being able to say no, from being able to actually, deal with the world on its own terms, it became a humiliated and backward empire. And then, sort of this century of humiliation actually started. So how did this happen, and why is it relevant today? So before I answer this, I think I need to stop and say a few words about what I mean by Western modernity, because it was in the title of my talk, so I really need to go there. So in many ways, the way I use this term, Western modernity, there are lots of similarities with early capitalism and how it emerged. But it's more than that. It's about the expansion of a singular and integrated economic system that was actually based on 3 European innovations. The first innovation that you have, this idea of sovereign states. And these sovereign states are equal to each other. Each has their own territory, their own laws, their own customs, and there's no higher authority above them. Of course, there are differences in power, but essentially there's nothing sort of above them, and they can deal with each other in a kind of rational sense. They're kind of the ultimate expression of some kind of civic rationality, and very much connected to the kind of philosophical traditions that were happening in Europe at the time. Secondly, and this is very important, the Europeans demonstrated a willingness to use violence, i.e. the military, to support and further the economic interests of its own citizens globally, and increasingly also had the capacity to do so in various parts of the world, be it the Americas, be it Africa, be it the Indian subcontinent, and for our story also in China. Which leads to this third innovation, so-called, and that's colonialism, right? That's another innovation, and a kind of, in a way, something that gave Europe the edge to spread its own economic system all over. So this modernity started in Europe, in could say in the Netherlands, of today's Netherlands, and England, to be precise, where the state actually was very heavily influenced by a class of traders that had global ambitions, and that had this kind of commitment to expanding trade wherever they went. So the Dutch East Indies Company, or the VOC, is one kind of prime example of this early state within a state, and these were the actors that actually were really spreading and pushing a certain way of dealing with things further and further away. So this was an early modern corporation, you could say. It had its own army, but it was also relying on the Dutch Navy to help it when it was in trouble, to kind of maintain and expand its trade networks, monopolistic trade networks. It also has a very dark history. It engaged in massacres of local population in what is today Indonesia, in the establishment of plantations, setting off also mass migration of workers from one part of the world to another. And most of Western Europe actually quite quickly adopted this type of model, mainly through imitation. So other countries like France and so on also went on to set up their own trading companies, their own colonies, their own spheres of interest. What was far less clear was how non-European states, and they existed, could become equal participants in this system. So the closest example probably is Russia. Much like China, an agrarian empire where most of the population lived almost like slaves, but which managed to reform itself to become something that looks very much like a modern European state under Peter the Great and his successors. The reforms, of course, were incomplete and painful. But nevertheless, Russia was then accepted as part of this world system that was spreading out. And even further afield, then how does this look like? Well, if you look at the Americas, Australia, Africa, there the Europeans came and saw nothing that looked like a modern state. So they just colonized it through their own settlers and incorporated it like that. In Asia, however, it's different, because there you had very old, complex societies which had states, militaries, bureaucracies, and so on. So very much, from the point of view of a European coming there, they recognized some level of statehood, or might I even say, civilization. And this enabled these states to actually, if they so desired, reform themselves and also become something more like a modern European sovereign state. So Japan obviously did it very well, but also Siam, Persia, and so on remained independent and tried to reform themselves into these kind of modern participants of this world system. Others, however, unsuccessful. The Mughal Empire in today's India, of course, fell to the British. Vietnam, again, a very complex, venerable state ended up being colonized by the French. So China's story here is actually particularly interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, only a relatively short time before its kind of traumatic encounter and fall from grace, China was actually the engine of the world economy. In many ways, it was the engine of the world economy without even realizing this itself. And I'm emphasizing this because we often hear that Qing Empire China was a kind of closed empire ruled by arrogant officials who didn't know anything about the outside world. And I'm kind of trying to challenge that a little bit. It's not the entire picture. But let me illustrate first what I mean by China being the motor of the world economy. Just by the way, all the slides are just pictures for atmospheric purposes and so on. But this next one, this is paper money. We all know, of course, that China invented paper money, right? It was introduced far earlier in the period we're talking about in the Song dynasty. But it was used quite extensively in the Ming dynasty, which is the dynasty that preceded the Qing. And this coincides roughly with the European Renaissance. So we're talking about, 1540s and so on. Paper money, of course, is only good as long as there's trust in it. As soon as there is no trust in paper money, then it's just paper, not money. And this is kind of what happened in the Ming times. With runaway inflation, people stopped trusting paper money. So what happens then, people switch to a more trustworthy currency. And that, in China's case, was silver. Just as a short aside, why is silver good? Because it's less expensive than gold. Gold is actually difficult to use for smaller transactions because it's too valuable. But unlike copper, it's very easy to check purity of silver. So it's a kind of perfect in-between Goldilocks zone here. So once this huge empire switches from using paper money to silver, of course, it has a huge demand for silver. Suddenly, everybody wants to have silver because you need silver for everything. Taxes are collected in silver and so on. So this huge demand is such that actually silver in China, when you measure it to how much gold you get for it, is worth twice as much than it is in Europe. So from a perspective of a European, going to China with a lot of silver, which you now have because of all the mines and the New World and the Americas, is great. It makes perfect economic sense. Historically, Chinese demand for silver was met by Japan, and actually there is one particular Japanese family, you may have heard of them, the Tokugawa clan, who control all the silver mines during the time, and they profit very handsomely off this and use this to essentially win the Civil War in Japan and set up the Tokugawa shogunate. So again, even in the history of Japan, we see how this change from paper money to silver, kind of has this direct effect on this neighboring country. But the Spanish become the biggest suppliers of silver during the time. And this silver-based trade was so lucrative that it created the first truly global network of trade. So this is the first time that you had a network that was actually connected by purpose, not by accident. You had, of course, networks before where we all know of the Silk Road and so on, but there very few people traveled from one end to the other of the Silk Road. The Silk Road is essentially a lot of small transactions that happen in a certain corridor. This is the first time when you had people knowing that they are part of this bigger network. So the arrows represent the flow of silver, and as you see, it kind of just ends up in China. The Europeans were, of course, not the only traders who were aware of this, business opportunity, let's say, but they were the only ones to use military power to force through a system that was essentially favoring them. So, while China's demand for silver may have been the engine of the first sort of global trading system, it was actually Western modernity, this kind of idea of like how international relations and how international economy should look like. That's what spread. So that's, the engine was running, but what it was producing was this. Later on, of course, the Europeans, develop a taste for Chinese products like silk, porcelain, and especially tea. So while, silver is the early instigator of this later on, the problem is a bit different. The problem is that the Europeans want, let's say, tea and porcelain and so on, but they have nothing to offer in return apart from silver. And this exchange, which used to be great for the Europeans, during the time this exchange erodes, as economists would have us believe that would always happen, a kind of equilibrium is established. So they still traded in China, all these Europeans were still going there, going to Canton trade, but they were increasingly unhappy. Why were they unhappy? Because actually China set up a very restrictive system of trade known as the Canton System, called after the city of Canton, or basically Guangzhou. And Europeans were only allowed to trade through intermediaries. They weren't allowed to, let's say, go and roam around China to look for the best tea supplier. They had to trust somebody in the port to go and do that for them. They were only allowed to trade in certain periods, so every winter they had to leave and go back to Macau, which we know was already under Portuguese control. Payments had to be made in silver, and as I said, that was increasingly expensive. And remember that Europeans elsewhere are used to, morphing and changing trade relations in a way that favors them, but here China was simply too strong to force into submission, so they just kind of learned to live with it. And in any case, huge fortunes were still to be made. So, but there was one trading nation that had slightly different plans, and that's the British. So we all know the British are obsessed with tea, still national obsession. And although they started growing it in Assam, in India, that particular enterprise doesn't go very well in the beginning. They tried growing tea in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants to work there. It's quite difficult to start this huge production out of nowhere. So they're still reliant on China for most of the tea that they drink. As I mentioned before, paying for tea with silver is expensive. So instead they come up with an ingenious solution, which is, of course, opium. So the British East India Company, which, much like the Dutch East Indies Company, was a kind of corporation that had a royal charter to conduct monopolistic trade, but increasingly was behaving like a state within a state, with its own army, its own bureaucracy, its own territories, and so on. So the British East India Company started producing opium in Bengal, using cheap labor there, and then transported it to China, where it was then sold to Chinese intermediaries. Many of the traders that actually operated in Canton as these independent traders who were moving the opium from the East India Company to the Chinese traders were actually Scottish, weirdly. This is because Scots were still kind of, at the time, locked out of the English-dominated elite, so many of them left Britain to seek wealth abroad. So there's actually a very good book published recently, which is Mr. Smith Goes to Canton, which is about 3 Scottish people, all of whom are called Mr. Smith, and all of which have these fantastic stories about how they interacted with the Chinese traders there. So these traders, they're committed to free trade. This is quite a novel concept at the time. Remember, most of these, the big corporations, they're not about free trade. The East India Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, they're monopolists, right? But these small traders, they believe in free trade. They believe in opening up the doors to commerce and so on. And increasingly, the British government actually also agrees with them. And they grow to great lengths to try and open China up. One Scottish trader even actually bribes a British Navy admiral to get 2 warships to go to Canton because he wants to actually force a Chinese merchant to pay a debt to him that he owes him. It doesn't really end too well. These free traders were constantly flirting with war, actually. And again, you see this kind of pattern of how trade and war, trade and violence actually were quite close during this time. The British government didn't always agree with them, but it did send several missions to China to try and persuade China, come on, let's open up, let's agree to something better than this system of trade. But the Chinese were not interested. Yet despite these limitations, the British were excellent at selling opium. This is just it's a kind of just a vignette showing two Chinese opium smokers as kind of atmospheric material, as I said earlier. So the British were so good at selling opium, in fact, that the flow of silver, which was always going towards China, reversed. Suddenly, China started bleeding silver out. Why? Because it had to pay for this addiction. And really, I mean, if you think about it, it's a great business model, right? You sell somebody something addictive, and they need it more and more and more and more, and great. It's, business is booming. And it wasn't just the British making money off this, of course. Chinese merchants in Canton were very happy to trade in opium, especially because many of them were hugely indebted to Armenian silver lenders, so they had to pay debt. And the average loan was the interest was about 36% per year. I mean, that was also the maximum allowed, but of course, everybody charged the maximum. So this was quite unsustainable. So, of course, many of them had to sell more and more opium to be able to pay for these debts. Obviously, an opium epidemic is bad for all sorts of reasons, health, society, and so on. But the effects here were felt beyond just, let's say, the users of the drug. So, for example, remember I said that silver was the currency of the state in China, right? That's also true for the rich, but not so much for the poor. If you're poor, you don't really use silver, you would use copper coins, because your transactions are quite small. But because there's suddenly a lack of silver in China, silver becomes more expensive when you express it in copper coins. And because the taxes are in silver, it means that if you're a peasant, you need to sell much more of your stuff. You need to produce much more to be able to pay those taxes, which now are worth much more of your copper money, let's say. And this is just one of the reasons, of course, why you also have a huge series of peasant rebellions, particularly in southern China, which was most affected by these shifts, by this slow car crash of China into these global trading networks in a way that was not actually advantageous to China, but was oftentimes, put it in a kind of inferior position. And remember again, how European modernity was spread not just by trade, but also by weapons, by war. This is, of course, exactly what happens here as well. China bans opium mainly. Opium was actually technically banned already. What they ban is the trade of foreigners selling opium. So that particular thing they sort of ban even more. But really they're worried about the outflow of silver. That's what really worries them. So they send this virtuous official, Lin Zexu. He's quite famous and he's quite venerated as a kind of a real stand-up guy. But I think he's probably a bit overrated, but that's another story. What does he do? He bans opium, he seizes all the opium stocks in Canton, and this infuriates the British. They protest, but nothing much happens really here. The Chinese even actually very interesting send a letter to Queen Victoria saying, sort of imploring her to intervene, because they say, well, it's bad. You have banned opium in Britain. Why are your people selling it here? I do not know if they receive a reply, but certainly I'm not aware of it. So the Chinese kind of rightfully suspect the British of a bit of hypocrisy here. But by then it's of course too late. You have powerful interest groups in London that are lobbying for war, and war is what they get. A couple of English sailors get drunk, they beat up a local villager to death, and then their commanding officer actually extracts them because he fears that if they get arrested by Chinese authorities, they will be executed. So they're taken to a British ship. There's a kind of trial there, but this infuriates the Chinese. They actually stop selling water and food to the British traders there, and basically war starts. So, boom. I'm not much of a war historian, but to summarize it goes very badly for China. So Britain becomes the first Western nation that actually by force extracts new types of treaties, new types of trading concessions from China, and these are the so-called unequal treaties. Before you know it, other European nations essentially smell, the blood in the water, and everyone from France to the United States to tiny Belgium has the opportunity to extract an unequal treaty. So what are these treaties actually? Well, they give certain protection to the lives of property, to the lives and property of Westerners in China. They allow them to trade everywhere they want. They allow Western missionaries to spread Christianity wherever they want. They get territorial concessions, so these are called treaty ports, where essentially the Chinese state has no jurisdiction. So, what does this kind of forceful and sudden entry into modernity look like? Well, initially it's chaos. So what happens in these treaty ports? It's chaos. And one British diplomat at the time writes, and I quote, "China as a whole was invaded by a swarm of adventurers from many nations during this period. Smuggling, trading in opium, the coolie traffic, evasion of duties, dealing in weapons, and other contraband were engaged in all sides," end quote. So it wasn't just adventurous foreigners coming to China. The quote mentions coolie traffic. Coolies were Chinese workers which were essentially sold into a kind of half-slavery, indentured servitude overseas. So this period also marks the start of mass Chinese migration outwards as well. So you really see how these kind of ruptures are quite sudden, and when they happen, they affect huge amounts of people. Right? So here you have that China becomes very much part of the world economy, but not on its own terms. From being a center of this old pre-modern world, it is now firmly on the periphery of the world. It is being drained of resources. It's a supplier of cheap labor. It's no longer even able to collect customs on its own. So the Westerners actually set up a body to collect customs on behalf of China, of course at a advantageously low rate. So all the advantages that China had historically soon began to be eroded. The Chinese state was becoming weaker and weaker. It was undermined by foreign imperialism, but also by domestic rebellions. Remember, the angry peasants. And even the traditional industries in China, like silk, porcelain, they start losing their edge when they're faced with this global market. Japan starts making better and cheaper silk. The Dutch, the English, and the Germans start, making cheaper porcelain and so on. And the British starts really succeeding at growing tea in India in a more efficient way. And then this really affects Chinese society, which for centuries was virtually unchanging, was kind of in this kind of stable equilibrium, one might call it, organized along Confucian doctrines. So this society began to fracture. There were new pressures, new social groups emerging. Some benefited from the arrival of modernity, some lost. New classes emerged, new divisions were created. And even in the wider East Asian region, you really see how China's system of diplomacy begins to fall apart. Remember earlier I mentioned sort of Korea and Vietnam being, very dutiful sort of, example students. Well, they're removed from China's sphere forcibly. Vietnam by France, Korea by Japan. So you really see even, on the international stage, China's world is crumbling. It's kind of washing away. Now, it would be unfair to say that the Qing Empire did absolutely nothing. The authorities in Beijing do realize that something needs to be done, something needs to change. So they embark on a series of reforms, and this is called the self-strengthening movement. So here you have them, some of the reformers. So the idea that underpinned this policy, right, was to keep Chinese essence, things like how society looks like, how the government is organized, and then only selectively adopt certain things from Western technology learning. Mainly they were interested in military applications because they felt the need to defend China, having just lost a war. So this etching, for example, is of the Zhongliyamen, which is a kind of the first foreign ministry of China, one which was established specifically to deal with foreigners on a more equal footing, because before the foreigners didn't fit anywhere. They were being handled by the Ministry of Rites, because foreign affairs is essentially about ritual that, sort of within this kind of Confucian state. However, unlike similar reformed institutions that happen in Russia, in Japan, also in the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese saw no need to kind of change the fundamentals. But not just that, even some of the outward appearance. So, for example, the Japanese government of this time, they start appearing in Western uniforms. Here you see it's not the case, right? So very much even the outward projection remains quite the same. So this approach, proved to be quite difficult. It's difficult to modernize selectively. It's expensive, it's wasteful, it's prone to huge corruption. It actually fails its very first test which is a war with Japan, again, boom. So this is 1895. This defeat was especially painful. Why? Because from China's point of view, Japan was always clearly an inferior state. And now suddenly, it has lost to Japan. It wasn't just China that was surprised. Most of the Westerners observing China at the time thought that Japan had absolutely no chance of defeating China in this war. And they were all quite surprised as a result. So from then on, China really is seen as the sick man of Asia. This is kind of an expression from that time, and also why, if you think of, let's say, the COVID pandemic, why so many people in China were outraged when you had this talk of the sick man of Asia, because it really connected and really resonated with the idea of humiliation that happened 100 years before. But it wasn't just foreigners which actually thought ill of China. Many domestic young Chinese nationalists and writers of the time saw in China the same kind of symptoms. They declared their country to be backward, deficient, to be insane. I mean, this is really a period of time when people are kind of questioning the existing morality, the existing fabric of society. So essentially, you see that this meeting with modernity is traumatic, of course. First of all, because China loses sovereignty, ports, all these kind of big politics things. But it's also traumatic on a kind of personal level, especially for intellectuals, for students, and so on. And by the early 20th century, there were actually a lot of people with a lot of very strong opinions about what direction China should take. So not just about how to deal with the immediate crisis, but actually thinking more kind of long term. The most famous among them at the time is a person who in the West is known as Sunyat Sen, who at the time was in exile in Japan, leading a movement to overthrow the Qing Empire from remotely and change China into a republic. And actually, the very first opportunity to do so comes pretty quickly. In 1911, 110 years ago, lots of anniversaries here, you have a revolution that ends the Qing Empire, and you have the birth of the Republic of China, which is a state that still very much exists, even though it's only limited to Taiwan. This revolution removed the empire, yes, but actually brought very little in its place. It brought chaos, civil war, and constant and increasing aggression by Japan. But in this chaos of New China, we see that modernity didn't just bring guns and opium and unequal treaties. It also brought quite radical new ideas. Everything from nationalism, which really importantly contributed to the fall of the Qing Empire, to things like socialism and so on. Soon, Chinese intellectuals and students turned their attention to China's international standing as well. Why was it so weak? Why is China so poor? Why is China treated so badly by all these imperialists everywhere? And after World War II, you have a particular kind of conflagration, huge anger in China that the colonies that were formerly controlled by Germany were just given to Japan by the Westerners, who were increasingly not that interested in the affairs of China, and were rushing towards their own apocalypse just a few decades later. So here we see a kind of a group of students. I mean, this is a later representation, protesting on May 4th. So this gives birth to the May 4th movement, which is kind of the intellectual origins also of the Communist Party of China. So it's very much important and still venerated. But before China could come to its own decision about whether it's going to be a bourgeois republic or a socialist state or a pseudo-fascist country or a communist country, this is all, this debate is rudely interrupted by Japan invading in 1937, starting a war that, of course, from a Western perspective, overlaps with World War II, but it's very important to understand it as a separate event, as an event also which is characterized by extreme brutality and extreme kind of inhumane behavior by the Japanese aggressors. Events like the Nanjing massacre and sort of tests of biological weapons on civilians are clearly events that resonate still. So this in many ways presents the culmination of this national humiliation, the war with Japan, that is. which then the government which took over in 1949 under the communists vowed that it will never happen again. So this is a very important kind of cornerstone of, let's say, not policy, but a more grand identity of what the CCP stands for in relation to China. Right? So what's interesting here, however, is that once the communists came into power, they kind of stopped talking about national humiliation. They stopped talking about Japan. They actually try to pursue friendly relations with Japan because they know that they need Japan. And it's actually the Americans that tell Japan, no, you will not deal with them. So they try very hard to forget and ignore this victimization. They wanted to focus squarely on the future. So while they accepted that wrongs had happened, they were mainly blamed on foreigners, on domestic reactionaries, and kind of there was a line to be drawn under this. And Mao Zedong himself, for example, writes, and I quote, "The Chinese have always been a great, courageous, and industrious nation. It is only in modern times that they have fallen behind. And that was due entirely to oppression and exploitation by foreign imperialism and domestic reactionary governments." End quote. So the emphasis here is on injustice, but this injustice has now been corrected. The domestic reactionaries have been overthrown. The Western imperialists have been chased out, and now that has been corrected. So what we saw in the Maoist period is actually a turning away from talking about the past, a really strong focus on the future with very strong also utopian undertones, which of course are partly to be blamed for not one but two huge disasters in Maoism, of course the Great Leap Forward and then the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. And there's very little space in this kind of chaotic time for any kind of balanced discussion of history, let alone some kind of transnational effort at real reconciliation, the type of which we saw, for example, in Europe after World War II. But so what changed? So why is it that today's CCP, the Communist Party, talks so often about national humiliation? Why can't they just be proud of China's achievements, for example? What's the purpose of bringing back this victim narrative, right? Didn't we already get rid of it? Well, of course, many things changed after the fall, after the end, didn't really fall, the end of Maoism, sorry. Politics in China moved from class struggle to something else. And I think this kind of ethnocentric nationalism increasingly became an important part of the narrative. And particularly following the failed student uprising in 1989, the CCP became very worried about what to replace this communist ideology with. Suddenly, people weren't buying it. Nobody was, cared about class struggle anymore. So what to replace it with? Well, one of the things, not the only, but one of the things was also this kind of the pride, but also the indignation, the nationalism, but also the victimhood. So you have a kind of, there's a really kind of interesting duality here of being both victim and victor, both, both being proud and ashamed of history. So this is just one kind of very happy utopian part here. So one of the things that actually happened is that you suddenly have a revival of all this information. Textbooks suddenly emerge detailing suffering at the hands of foreign aggression, particularly Japan, but also, let's say, the earlier imperialists and so on. You see this in history textbooks, and really this victimhood and martyrhood become quite important. So, as a kind of epilogue, how does this affect then modern Chinese diplomacy? Well, it makes it very difficult, right? I mean, China often behaves like a very fragile superpower, one that can get offended very easily, whose ego can get bruised very easily. Domestically, casual nationalism is increasingly not only common, it's almost expected. Often you see, various Chinese celebrities are often hounded for infractions against national pride. For example, recently, I forgot who it was, I'm not a big kind of celebrity follower, but somebody went to the Yasukuni shrine in Tokyo to take a selfie. This was, of course, the end of this person's career. That's it, forget about it. So particularly when it comes to relations with Japan, this victim narrative that was constructed over the last 4 decades is not going to go away. But it's interesting because this is a victim narrative that did not exist following the war. there were decades where this was not a thing that was talked about. Because why? Because it interfered with a more optimistic vision of China being reborn after 1949, right? Now, talking about all these poor civilians being slaughtered, it doesn't fit with the kind of heroic image. So this was suppressed. But of course, when you suppress, painful memories especially, they tend to come back, even more ferocious. And now there's a kind of an inflation of various memory sites and museum sites dedicated to national humiliation. It's very much an important part here. Now, this was an oversight. This should be from before, but this, I'll just finish with this one. So with Xi Jinping's turn to this kind of more aggressive nationalism, which we know is happening for a variety of reasons that have to do with his ambition to discipline the party, which had become corrupt, but also with kind of to project a new image of strength. And the idea of national humiliation is very much a central part of patriotic education. I mean, here we see just, this is just a random group of children, of school children saluting, holding up a banner that says, never forget national humiliation, and then it rejuvenates China, to translate quickly. And this idea of rejuvenation, which is a central tenet of particularly now Xi Jinping's policy, I think, is inextricably linked to the idea of victimhood. Right? So it's very much about correcting wrongs, but not in a way that was done in the Maoist period, where it was kind of said, we have corrected them, but rather this is still an ongoing thing where, sort of any kind of offense must still be dealt with. And this really hardens the domestic discourse. It creates an atmosphere of hypersensitivity, one might say, to all sorts of perceived international offenses. So it's not surprising that as a result, relations with neighbors, not just Japan, which clearly is the aggressor, but also with neighbors like Korea are at historic lows because of perceived offenses to national pride. Now, I would say that this kind of this victimhood should, of course, remind us of all the injustices that China faced when it was forcibly dragged into modernity, by the British and by sort of this European system of trade, which I talked about at length. But we must also keep in mind that this is a narrative that is very much instrumentalized. There was a political decision taken at some point, maybe not just one decision, but a series of decisions, right, to bring it back, to use it, to propagate it, to put it in textbooks, to kind of make it there, make it loud and make it out there. So this decision to reawaken the narrative was political and instrumental. And therefore, I think the effects that it will have on China's relations with the world, yes, they're an echo of history, of course. And it's very important to know this history to be able to understand why, what is never forget national humiliation. But at the same time, the current, I think, sensitivity is equally also a result of a newfound or more recent turn of the Communist Party towards a kind of new brand of nationalism, which wants to create a strong China, but yet is not quite sure how to let go of some of the painful past. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gelia. Please take a seat and we can start the Q&A session. Are there any questions? What I will do then is... yeah, you have the first, please, Mr. Zarakis, start with the first one.
I would like to ask a question arising from my personal impressions. Most of the Chinese that I have met for work or as friends, they always differentiate between the Greeks and other Europeans. And they always, the motto is always, you and us, we are the only people who have a real history. is this the real reason for this difference in their perception, or is it related more with the fact that just like the Arabs look towards the Greeks as a Western nation that has no imperialist history?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, right? So to think about also the role of those European countries who do not have a history of guilt and a lot of skeletons in the cupboard when it comes to relations with China. I'm also like to think about, well, how can those countries actually improve relations, let's say, between EU and China? That would be kind of a thought onward from that. But generally, I think Chinese diplomacy is also very good at finding commonalities. So one thing that looking towards Greece is immediately strikes somebody who is trying to further relations is, well, these are two ancient civilizations. Both countries actually go to great lengths to claim this heritage, and so of course this is a commonality, right? So I think it's both. I think it's both a kind of instrumentalized, let's say, approach, but at the same time I think it is really important to say that countries in Europe, like Greece, which do not have a history of imperialism in the 19th century and so on, can actually be conduits for better relations, right? And they should be used for that, because it is very difficult when if every time the British or the Americans send ships through the South China Sea to actually very rightfully enforce accepted rules of laws of the sea and so on, but the optics are wrong, right? Because they are again sending gunboats like they did back in in the 1840s and so on. So I think I think you're right to point out that it is important. It's not just fluff. I think it is important to kind of say that there are other countries which have the possibility of better relations.
Okay, very good. I can jump in with a couple of questions that I have then. I will use my privilege as chair. So first of all, one historical and one contemporary question. I'm really fascinated with the comparison between Qing China and Meiji Japan.
Yeah.
They were both confronted with modernity around the same time, but had massively different kind of responses to it. Okay, the Meiji went about and led a nation that industrialized very fast, as you know, and became a world power pretty quick, within decades, whereas the Qing, they just couldn't get there. Right? Do you think this is an accident of history? Or do you think there are, because I know you also have a background in Japanese studies as well, do you think it's an accident of history or there are other reasons for that?
I mean, partly it can just be an accident of history, but there are certain structural reasons, I guess, which existed in Japan and allowed it to pursue very similar reforms that some of the Qing officials were thinking about, but far more successfully. I think partly it has to do with the fact that Japan was already on the periphery of its old world system. So Japan belonged to the world system that was centered on China as a peripheral state, whereas of course China was, of course, its central core, let's say, power. But I think more importantly, there are certain traits maybe that developed from 17th century Japan onward, which enabled it to actually industrialize very quickly. And a lot of authors have noted on the presumed similarity between some of the Japanese trading and commerce families and those that existed, let's say, in Holland and in England. So there was a kind of a social, let's say, the soil was fertile for the seeds of capitalism to grow, right? So something like that. But it's also other things. As I mentioned earlier, Qing China was ruled by an elite class that was increasingly seen as foreign. It wasn't before. I mean, this is also quite important about why I was talking about the ideas of nationalism and so on. You know, it wasn't that you know, that the Qing were always considered to be problematic because of their heritage, but increasingly towards the end, this was very much sort of, you know, what prevented them from pursuing the kind of reforms that happened in Japan. In Japan, it was easier. The emperor was the symbol of the whole nation, and you know, people rallied around that. I mean, with you know, slight civil wars and weapons and so on. But yeah, I think it's generally that. No?
Okay, great. Any other questions from the audience? I can then ask my second question,
Sure.
which I hope it will be provocative enough to prompt more questions. Now, victimhood, when you present yourself as a victim, is not an act of confidence, is it? It's an act of unresolved issues that are possibly projected into the future. I talk like my psychiatrist. So this victimhood, do you think that contradicts what we perceive as China being a very kind of confident, rising nation? Can a victim rise like that? So what is there? What is this contradiction that we're looking at, and how is it relevant in terms of its of China's kind of international behavior?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because like on a personal note, of course, everybody would hope that victims can rise, right? I mean, we all want to believe that optimistic story that people who have been offended and have been wronged can, you know, get over this and actually so on. But that's one thing that you talk about people, and then another thing to talk about states, right? So while, you know, it kind of gets more complicated when you talk about the state's emotions, right? Because is this an emotion? Does China have emotions? Does the state of China have emotions? Maybe like as an aggregate, maybe. So I prefer to think of it as what purpose does it serve? Like why is it that this victimhood is being emphasized over and over and over again? There's two options, right? Either it's sincerely felt, maybe the leaders of China, when they see that, I don't know, like Taiwan appears in a drop-down menu at a hotel reservation desk, feel so emotionally interrupted and offended that they must, you know, then force sanctions. Or maybe it's actually something else. It actually serves a different kind of purpose, a purpose to kind of constantly remind, let's say, the other that, you know, that China is back and that China is angry and that, you know, it is justified in its own reactions and so on. And I think maybe that's one of the things. Maybe it's a kind of way to lessen, you know, the ambitions. But I think it will blunt like Chinese ambitions, right? I mean, it's not. It's difficult to project confidence when you also, you know, lose it over small things, apparently, right? And it's also difficult for other nations to then earnestly deal with China, because, I mean, even on a practical level, right? People need to be now trained about what may or may not offend, you know, the Chinese government and so on. And these things happen all the time. That, you know, somebody gets offended here or there, and then, you know, there's consequences to this. So I think it's also, when you think about like victimhood, I think one thing that I fear was a really lost opportunity was actually to deal with the actual victims, right? People who were, you know, who lost family members, who were, you know, on the receiving end of particularly like Japanese violence during the war, and their experiences were swept under the carpet, not seen as important because it was a period of celebration and, you know, everything was fine. And now this victimhood is to me, it's kind of confected, right? It's not the victimhood of victims, it's the victimhood of a state, which I think states can't have emotions. I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a materialist. So if it's not emotions, then it's something else, you know?
Good, great. Yes, please.
Microphone.
We need it for the broadcasting.
Okay.
So on the same topic of victimhood, I was wondering, is there, I'm asking for your opinion, do you think that it might serve also an inside, is it maybe something that's happening because for inside consumption as well, like taking the attention from time to time towards, I don't know, from one problem that China might be facing at a certain time to something that is not there right now, but, oh, I'm still doing without? No? Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, I don't know if you heard me, maybe you already...
Very loud now.
So I was just quickly saying again, could it be that this victimization, victimhood, is instrumentalized, right, from the Chinese government from time to time for more inside consumption, serving different purposes? I know it's maybe a very cynical way of seeing things, and I know this cannot be the only way of seeing this, but could this also be an option for us to consider?
I think absolutely. I mean, not just with victimhood, but I think a lot of the let's say behavior of the Chinese state outwardly, very importantly, serves a domestic audience, right? But the problem is that, and you know, I can kind of mention a case which is fairly recent, which is the disputes between China and Japan over its maritime border. And there you have a kind of a recurring, let's say, wave pattern, right, of some kind of dispute happening, and then it kind of cools off, and then, you know, again, you know, it kind of heats up and so on. But what changed, let's say, in the 2000s was that China started to use domestic outrage as part of its negotiation strategy with Japan, for example. So, you know, huge amounts of students were bussed in to Beijing to kind of bolster, you know, spontaneous protests. You know, Toyota dealerships were you know, attacked and burned down and, you know, stoned and so on. And then once actually the negotiations moved, this was shut down, right? But the problem is that my question is, like, can you always shut down this kind of genie of national outrage that you've created? And the answer is, well, not really, because we've seen now that, you know, increasingly this is not a narrative that is entirely controlled by the Communist Party, right? You do have kind of outrages. I mean, you know, for now they're mainly confined to social media, things like that, right? Where you know, you have the kind of vigilantes against you know, also domestic actors which dare to step out of line and then are, you know, swiftly punished. So I think I mean, yeah, you can. It's part of a kind of let's say a system of disciplining, right? Also domestically. In terms of like taking attention away, I mean, I'm sure that could happen as well, but you know, again, it's kind of hard to talk about it without like proof. But you know, I mean, I think that there's definitely a study there to be made in terms of like when do outrages happen, and do they coincide with any domestic events or not? But I think the problem here is that once you start doing this, also as a policymaker, you begin to lose space, because then every time you step back, you can be perceived as weak. And that's the one thing which the CCP, but particularly I think now with Xi, does not want to do. They do not want to appear weak. So then how do you do? How do you negotiate your way out of let's say a disagreement with Japan if any kind of concession might be punished by loss of legitimacy, right? So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you then have to be more and more radical. So that's why I'm saying that this victimhood is not good. It fuels a kind of a policy which is not good for China. Like that's, you know, let's be clear. Let alone for international relations or regional relations and so on.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. I had no idea about this century of humiliation. It's the first time I hear something about this. And came up in my mind how it is connected with the current projects of China like BRI, the New Silk Road, and the fear of Europe and the Western world that China is sooner or later conquer Western countries. If this common memory in the state, if a state has a memory, or to the common people, if this will bring, will take a revenge, let's say, for this century, and if these projects will bring up Chinese nationalism inside the Chinese society. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really topical question, right? Because it's happening at the moment, all these projects and BRI and so on. I mean, the first thing I would mention that there is a connection here, right? Because you see that Chinese actors are being very sensitive, very careful about avoiding any accusation of imperialism or colonialism or anything like that, right? So the message here is, this is different. We're not doing the same thing. We haven't just learned the lessons that were inflicted on us and now we're doing our own thing elsewhere, but this is actually something else. And this is the origin of this, ideas like win-win and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think under conditions that we will live in this kind of global capitalist system, China is in many cases the stronger, wealthier partner. So when it invests into, let's say, into Kenya and so on, it does so from a position of strength. And this inherently then brings problems and accusations of imperialism, of colonialism, and so on and so forth. So one thing is that they're very careful to keep the narrative clean, right, let's say. But on the other hand, some of these projects, it's very difficult to not be open to such accusations. But not in a way that's different from Shell or any other Western corporation, right? But what's maybe interesting here is that I think having, and this is like an area that I've studied recently quite a lot, like the host governments often actually are very happy to accept China's proclamations that this is a different thing. Why? Because then it's very useful to sell this domestically, right? Mm-hmm. To say that, oh yes, we're borrowing money from a Chinese bank to build a railroad that nobody will use, but it doesn't matter because this is it's win-win. It's new relations. It's we're fighting imperialists together, right? So there's a certain amount of almost social capital maybe that China has in the developing world that it developed throughout the Maoist period, and actually very earnestly. I mean, in the neighborhood here in Albania, Chinese, let's say, really believed, right, in the relationship between China and Albania. They were building factories, mines, and so on. And then at some point, of course, the relationship soured because Albania sooner or later had a fight with everyone in its communist history, even with China. And this was maybe a kind of precursor of the same kind of spirit that still exists in the BRI. But let's not fool ourselves. The BRI is a project for state-owned enterprises who want to make profits, who want to secure their position domestically, who are run by Communist Party officials who have careers to think about, right? So it's not, of course, goodwill. But it is true that they do really are careful to not appear or not be called that. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, the West is calling China a new imperialist, but it's a bit rich, right? I mean, I always, yeah, I mean, whenever, I don't know, like the French government complains about Chinese in Africa, and I'm like, really? So I think, and again, maybe back to your question, right? So it is also the role of the more neutral countries, which are not burdened, but which nevertheless do believe in sort of ideals of democracy and freedom of speech and so on. It's also for us to kind of speak up about this, because the French and the English can't do it because they've been compromised historically quite a lot.
I would like to return on Giorgos' question again. I wonder, inside China, how much is spread the debate about if China is imperialistic, even in a Chinese way, if it's behaving in an imperialistic way. And as far as we know, but I don't know how strong is this feeling, there are debates that the Chinese government, they're giving too much resources in order to develop the BRI project all over the planet. And while they can use these resources in order to develop Chinese economy and Chinese society instead of, So there is such a debate. I would like, if you have more information, to expand this article. Thank you.
I mean, not information in the sense of like really current stuff. I mean, I would have to think about like what, also because so little research is being done in China at the moment that we kind of hear about. This Corona has really kind of severed a lot of the links. But the BRI itself, I mean, I know like a couple of years ago, we were talking, maybe you were actually there, and somebody said like, oh, are you still working on the BRI? You know, nobody cares about it anymore in Beijing. Because, you know, it's kind of exactly for these reasons, right? It was seen as kind of maybe too much, too ambitious, too much too quickly. And I think many of the concerns, if you read, let's say, you know, some of the freer parts of the Chinese press, you know, like essentially business publications like Caixin and so on, they complain about things like inefficiency. Or corruption, or you know, this project did not satisfy the high demands, which I think is great. I mean, it's kind of the beginning of some kind of a review and monitoring and a kind of reflection of like what it is that you know the government is doing abroad and the state-owned enterprises are doing abroad. But I think it's very difficult to do this earnestly if your debate is so limited and stunted and so controlled, right? So I don't think that, you know, there's a huge amount of debate, but I would love to hear the debate behind the closed doors, right? I mean, what I want to know is like, how does the party feel about the BRI? Are they happy with the results? Because I don't think they would be. I mean, the results haven't been that fantastic, right? I mean, it's a lot of state-owned enterprises made a lot of money. That's true, but the kind of pushback that China received internationally, it's probably not worth it. And a lot of these projects have given China a bad name as a country that will lend, but only to fund its own companies and so on. So reputationally, I don't think it's been a success. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's two options. Either, as we actually just this week heard, that now China will no longer fund any new coal power plants, which were, you know, coal was, you know, sort of 30% of BRI is coal. So there's clearly huge changes happening, some kind of reevaluation of what the BRI is happening. But in terms of like what exactly this might mean, that I'm not so sure about, simply because I don't know. I mean, I can kind of speculate, but not with real facts, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I mean, if you think of the project of cost coherent Piraeus, right? I mean, this existed before the BRI. It became very politicized globally after the BRI was introduced. Before that, I mean, no one was really talking about it. It was a successful investment, and then after that, it became almost the Trojan horse of China and Europe and so on. And this really came after the 2000, after the BRI was introduced. So, really good point there.
Yeah, you see how like controversies which would have remained local, I'm sure like any big project can be controversial, right? Even the most well thought out project will be controversial. But even, especially the ones that are not maybe thought out, the ones that have actual problems, you know, of course they're controversial sort of in the country, in the bilateral relations. But yeah, Piraeus became controversial globally, but not because of the things that maybe it should be controversial. It was controversial simply as a kind of symbol, a kind of totem of this belief that China is now being an imperialist country that is going to buy half of Europe. Even though, of course, Europe should be so lucky. I mean, what we do is sell stuff to China. So,
we wrote an article with Igor looking at these narratives of the BRI around certain projects. And about Piraeus, there was this French academic, retired academic, who was claiming that the goal is to turn Piraeus into a double-use port, so have a military base of the Chinese in Piraeus. And this was a dominant narrative, right, in the debate. People believe that the perception of the BRI was formed around this nonsense.
But I think, if I can kind of, this is an expression from Slovenian, which is my own country, if I can divert water to my own mill, which I'm sure you understand what that means, I think it's really interesting how it's this kind of behavior that I was talking about, right, which informs the way that we see China now, right? It's that if, there's an investment in Piraeus, this is a treaty port now, essentially, right? So it's, what we have learned through history we then apply to new cases very quickly. And it's not always accurate, but that's what it is. I mean, history is what, kind of colors our perception of the present. Yeah.
Good. Are there any more questions, or can we call it a day? Yeah? Okay, so there are no more questions. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you for having me.
For coming and for everything. And thank you all for attending.
Yes, thank you for the questions.
Against all odds and COVID conditions and so on.